Thank you very much, Rainey. It's a great pleasure to be here. Now, because this is Kant's 300th birthday, this conference has seen the Enlightenment has absolutely centered on the city that Stephen talked so wonderfully about this morning, Kaliningrad, with some occasional Switzerland, possibly France, but I want to take you further west and further north and to a different kind of intellectual territory too. So I'm going to talk a bit about a figure who is often seen as the founder of economics as we know it. And whether or not that designation is justified, like founders of most scientists, until some decades ago, people doing actual modern economics didn't go back and read the original text, The Wealth of Nations, at all. But then everything changed. Unlike, most scientific founding texts, The Wealth of Nations became very popular. The obvious exception to the rule that scientists today don't read the founding text is Darwin's Origin of Species, to which evolutionary biologists go back again and again. But nowadays, even in economic papers and in policy papers, you can find plenty of references to Smith. He's been appropriated, taken over, seen as the architect of a new and very much improved style of economic arrangement, one that has brought, allegedly, considerable relief to the world, raising the average income in all sorts of places, etc., etc. That's the way Adam Smith is usually seen. I want to see him rather differently. Since I think this appropriation is incorrect, it stands in the way of recognizing Smith as a truly great Enlightenment thinker and one who has important things to say to us in our times, if only we read him correctly. Now, the trouble with these contemporary practices of citation is they tend to be highly selective. There is one sentence that is quoted more often than others. It occurs early in The Wealth of Nations. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. This is often seen as underlying Smith's construction of the economic agent. The economic agent, Homo economicus, often identified with the real physical being, a member of the species Homo sapiens. Now, Homo economicus is, when rational and unconfused, out to promote this figure is usually seen as male, I think, his self-interest. What that means is that the preferences of human beings do not typically take account of the well-being of others, and human beings, when rational and unconfused, act to maximize the satisfaction of their preferences. They do the best they can. And some people would say this picture is already present in Smith. But that immediately poses a problem, because Adam Smith was not only the founder of economics, assuming he was also a moral philosopher. And his moral philosophy, in a book that went through 6 editions in his lifetime, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, is very different in terms of its picture of humanity from the picture painted in The Wealth of Nations, according to the interpretation that's usually given to that book. So, Smith's theory of moral sentiments begins with what he calls the natural sympathy of human beings for one another. That is, Smith says that we have abilities to recognize the wants, the inclinations, the intentions and the plans of our fellow creatures and adjust our conduct so that we help them in achieving what they want. We have a kind of ability to put ourselves in their position and to see the world from their point of view. Smith would agree with Stephen that this ability is limited. But he thinks, and this is the core of his moral theory, to which I will come back in a moment, and he thinks that actually the task of moral theory is to enable us to expand our partialities, to make them more encompassing, probably never ideally encompassing, but there is, in Kantian terms, going to be a kind of regulative ideal, to which we'll come in a bit. In the meantime, let's try to understand the butcher, the brewer, and the baker. It's entirely consistent with Smith's theory to suppose that there are some contexts, including most business transactions, in which it's morally better to suppress our individual partial sympathies. So, just as when you take on a particular role, it can be entirely appropriate and indeed morally required of you not to do things that you would be required to do in other situations. So the economic arrangements of a particular state are best conducted, Smith thinks, if we suppress our individual partial sympathies for the most part. In fact, it's relatively easy to prove. I can prove it, that in fact in a society that sort of started to do its transactions according to our partial sympathies, those who were most sympathetic would be driven out very quickly by those who were less sympathetic, and we would eventually reach a state in which we would not expect our dinner from the benevolence of the butcher, the baker, or the brewer. Okay, very good. So that's a way of understanding the relationship between these two books. We are not homo economicus. We do have these emotional ties to one another. We do have these abilities to empathize with one another. But for the purposes of commercial life, it is often, and I will stress the often better if we set those on one side, as if we operate as if we were not benevolent beings, partially benevolent beings. Now let me look with you at what I take to be the core of Smith's moral theory. This relates to some things that Alida said yesterday. Smith believes that if we were solitary creatures, we would be unable to develop a concept of our actions as subject to criticism, as being in need of change in some cases and in need of fortification in other cases. But society, he thinks, provides us with a mirror. Indeed, not just one mirror, but many mirrors. We interact with a large number of different people. And he thinks that the task of the moral agent is to construct within himself or herself an agent called the impartial spectator. Smith often refers to this being as the little man in the breast, who, as it were, gives you guidance when you face a difficult issue. Now, how is this spectator to be constructed? It's by using all of the mirroring that we get from our fellow creatures. So I want to say that unlike, there's a sort of quasi-Kantian view which might be called the view from nowhere, I want to suggest that what Smith is offering is the view from everywhere at once. His ideal agent is the person who can see the world and the potential changes in the world given the actions that he or she produces from the perspectives of all those who would be affected by it. This is obviously a very, very difficult thing to do, but it requires us, when we're considering an action, to consider the ways in which that action would affect the lives of other people and to look at that from their perspectives on those actions. I developed this in a very particular way. I think there's something to this. There is, my position here will play off against some ideas of Rawls and some ideas of Habermas in a way that you will see in a moment. First, moral assessment. So moral assessment then is a matter of trying to synthesize the views from various perspectives. Notice that this is all very particularistic. we aren't dealing at the beginning with general principles at all. What we are dealing with is particular decisions that individual beings have to make, or societies have to make. So we have to try to find out what representatives of those perspectives would conclude if they tried to take seriously the view from all other perspectives. So we situate ourselves in imagination in a world of other individuals who are all trying to take the perspective from everywhere at once. This is obviously a fiction, it's obviously an idealization, and it is immediately and properly accused of being completely blind to the considerations that motivated Stephen to write the first part of his essay, namely human partialities. So this actually connects with Kant, whom we know actually read Smith. Kant has two versions of the categorical imperative that have come up in this conference already. There's the universalize, can you universalize the maximum which you're intending to act test? And then there's the principle of humanity. Treat humanity in yourself, in others, always as an end and never as a mere means. But there's a third one. The third one, which I think of as the ugly duckling formulation of the categorical imperative, suggests that we think of ourselves as part of a, in Kant's terms, kingdom of ends. And I like that idea, and I like to give it a serious political reading. So let's think of ourselves as if we were lawgivers in a republic, because there's no sovereign in this realm, in a republic consisting of all others, or perhaps just all other humans, perhaps all other rational beings, perhaps all other sentient beings. That will depend on the issue that comes before us. Now our task is to try to act in such a way that we could find a way of acting that was acceptable to all of these other agents, such that if they put themselves in the state of proper engagement with us, as we try to put ourselves in the state of proper engagement with them, then we wouldn't necessarily come to the conclusion that anybody would choose as the first and best choice, but a conclusion for action with which all could live, as it were. So, I think of this as a way of going beyond Homo economicus to something much richer. So Adam Smith, to come back now to the economic realm, is quite clear that we naturally desire to be in harmony with our fellows. We want not only to be loved, but to be lovely, he says, or to be that thing which is the natural and proper object of love. That's a very interesting, it seems to me, very worthy moral goal. And we achieve it through developing in ourselves a kind of responsiveness to our fellows that they, trying to engage with us, appreciate. So the morality and the ideal of being in social harmony come together. So he says, in the theory of moral sentiments, the rich are led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution of the necessaries of life which would have been made had the earth been divided among all its inhabitants. It's an interesting thought. It's probably not true of our society. Whether it was true of Smith's society is I think, open to question. But I'm bringing this in because this is one of Smith's two other uses of the phrase, the invisible hand. He uses it once in connection with astronomy. He thinks of the planets as being kept in their orbits as if by an invisible hand. And he thinks in matters of morality that the things have been set up in such a way that we can't get too much deprivation in the world. A bit optimistic, one might think. But his concerns about simply thinking about the goal of making yourself rich, which, of course, the typical appropriation of Smith thinks as the goal of economic life, is also undercut by a remark he makes about the difference between A man who is possessed by the desire to succeed, and he uses that word, he's been visited by this desire to succeed. So the hard-driven, hard-driving businessman or entrepreneur, and the beggar. And he says, the beggar who suns himself by the side of the highway possesses that security which kings are fighting for. It is a very different picture of Smith so far than the picture that is given to us by his right-wing advocates. So did Smith forget all the things he'd said in the Theory of Moral Sentiments when he wrote The Wealth of Nations? No. The later book is in fact full of moral concerns. He says, for example, that no society can be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. Smith is actually rather big on raising the poor. He talks about something called the liberal reward of labor, which he thinks is most available in societies that are growing. So he sees actually economic growth as being good in that it raises the wages of the working classes, and it takes them to a better state. This has, as one of Smith's successors, Malthus, will point out, the unfortunate consequence that their children will have greater survivorship. The survivorship of a woman's children, if she had, say, 15 children in Smith's Scotland, is probably about 2. What happens is you get more people, and that gives you more potential workers, and that then brings things down, which leads to Malthus's famous conclusion that the poor will always be with us. But Smith is also very interested in helping the working class to a better future. And he sees this as, he sees a scandal in the fact that the masters, the people who organize labor and use labor, are able to get together and decide on arrangements that enable them to sort of set prices very high and set wages very low. And he says, look, the workers ought to be able to unionize. So there are lots of progressive elements in Smith's book. But now I'm going to come to the most famous one, that I haven't yet quoted, the one that right-wingers love to quote. So, in The Wealth of Nations, at a famous point, we get the idea of this, all too visible white hand. So we get, and here's the quote. By directing his industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worse for the society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. This is taken by many people to be a stunning repudiation of the idea of providing, by some social plan, security arrangements, social nets, a welfare state, anything to protect the poor and those who are sort of pushed aside and marginalized by society. But notice what Smith didn't write. He didn't say, in all other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention, nor is it ever the worse for the society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he always promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. Much of the right-wing appropriation of Smith is based on the version that Smith didn't write, not on the version that he did. But surely Smith is the great apostle of the free market. Surely he is the one who has given us the free market and neoliberal capitalism and all the rest of it. Well, yes and no. It depends what you mean by free market. The first thing to say is that there's no such thing as a completely free market. All markets have to be regulated. Smith saw this But since his exploration of this theme occurs in Book 5, which comes at the end of a very long book, and it's about 350 pages long, I think, we can understand why perhaps the right wing has not actually read it, or at least read it very thoroughly. So, Book 5 of The Wealth of Nations explores the necessary conditions for markets to function. What you have to have for a market is a system of law. What you have to have for a market is a way in which people from distant places can bring goods to one another. What you also need from a free market is a certain amount of education so that people can find their ways to the goods that they need for their lives. And Smith explores all of those themes in Book 5. And it's in the context of education in Book 5 that he almost backs away from The Wealth of Nations. The Wealth of Nations begins, of course, with the division of labor, the famous pin factory, and employment in which people spend their lives repeating the same simple tasks. And that drives them, well, I wouldn't say crazy, but perhaps numb is the best word. These people have no occasion to exert their understanding or to exercise their invention in finding out expedients for difficulties which never occur. They naturally lose, therefore, the habit of such exertion and generally become as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to be. And the torpor of the worker under the division of labor is something that Smith greatly rejects. And you might think at that point that Adam Smith, having written a very long book already, would say, no, I've got to go back to the beginning and start all over again. He didn't do that, but some decades later, a guy who was in Germany who was trying to teach himself a political economy by reading the work of Adam Smith and taking notes on the text of The Wealth of Nations, after having written the first 3 of his manuscripts, came to the 4th and found out alienated labor. And that did bring him to a rewrite. All right, now, I want to explore this notion of the free market because in doing so, I'll be able to bring the ethics and the economics together. So you can combine ethics and economics in a way that a few contemporary economists are beginning to do already, and that was absolutely standard for most of the history of economics. We should never forget that the people who came before the economic revolution of the late 19th century, people like Ricardo and Mill, were deeply into reformist politics and thought about these issues, the issues of economics in ethical terms. Then we think at the end of the 19th century of there being a revolution in economics, the so-called marginal evolution, which gave us classical economics. But even there, people like Marshall and Pigou and Keynes were not only philosophically interested, they were philosophically creative, and they thought of markets as being subject to moral evaluation. So we could, if we wished, take Smith's moral view, the view from everywhere at once, to set the goals and adjust the regulations to promote the goals we have identified. The goal doesn't have to be what economists tend to call efficiency, or maximization of production, or minimization of prices, or whatever. They don't have to be that at all. Several contemporary economists have started to argue for something like this. And in particular, I'll point to Alvin Roth, who has spent most of his academic life developing this theme. So his view is there's no such thing as the completely free market. All markets have regulations. You set the regulations up in such a way as to get to the goals you want to get to. And I think Smith's on board with that. I think the view from Smith that combines both books is the view that the theory of moral sentiments gives you a methodology for trying to figure out what the goals of a particular market are, and then you regulate the market in such a way that you promote those goals. So, what exactly does neoliberal economics want? It doesn't want a completely unregulated market. That's a mythical beast. It wants what seems on the face of it to be a minimally regulated market. So we just get along with just the bare minimum that we need to get any market, things like the transportation system, the legal system, and so forth. And the goal is, of course, to deliver consumer goods at the lowest prices. That's what such a minimally regulated market might plausibly try to achieve. But that isn't quite the market structure we have in the global economy these days, because typically there are two things added. One is some form of anti-monopolistic legislation, because it's seen that you're not actually going to get the intended goal, the pushing down of consumer prices, if you allow monopolies or quasi-monopolies like those combinations of the masters that Smith was so upset about. But we also have something else. We don't go back to the kinds of conditions that were prevalent in the Victorian economy that was criticized by Engels, or the early 20th century economy that was criticized by George Orwell. We don't have the kinds of allowances of labor practices that would enable employers to demand, 14, 16, 18-hour work days. We don't allow children to be taken out of school and put into the production line. Now, those are more regulations than are strictly necessary. So there is some backing away from the minimally regulated market. Now, what I want to say about neoliberal economics is not that moral decision-making has been abandoned. Choices have been made, but they have been pushed underground. They've been kept out of view. And the first task of any critique of contemporary economic theory seems to me to bring those choices into plain view so that we can then fulfill what I think of as the complete Smithian enterprise, namely to do it properly by restoring what happened in the prehistory of classical economy, namely the working out through moral and political and social thinking of the appropriate goals, and then trying to structure the markets to achieve those goals. And I think Smith gives us some resources for doing that. Now, so much for rehabilitating Smith. Now for something completely different, because I want to talk about the urgency of our need to do this, and it's already sort of crept out of my mouth at various moments in the discussion. And it is, of course, the threat of climate change. Why has so little been done? So let me review some things about our recent history. In the late 1980s, a man named James Hansen, very prominent climate scientist, testified to the United States Senate on an incredibly hot afternoon in Washington, D.C., about the dangers of global warming. There was actually fairly instant uptake. Indeed, there was a conference early in the 1990s at which the heads of various states came together, and a particular head of state from a prominent and quite affluent country got up and said, "No sense in squabbling about this. We shouldn't be arguing about who should pay or what we should do, and we should just get on with it. To do it, we've got to pay. We've got to do it. Got to get it done." Who was that? Margaret Thatcher. One of the architects of this revolution that had produced this new economic state. And she didn't realize the complete contradiction between what she'd argued for and what she was now advocating in the face of the climate threat. So, why is it that so little gets done? Why is it that, 35 years on, we are still struggling to set targets and then to keep to them? So there was a moment of great optimism in 2015 in Paris when there was an accord on fighting climate change. As everybody who was informed and had been watching the situation at that time said, well, it's not enough, of course, but it's a big step forward. Okay, we move on to the present day, or even earlier, as has been said again and again and again recently, Have those targets been kept? No. We've fallen way short of them in most parts of the world. Are our governments doing more? No. In many cases of affluent nations, they're backing away. How can the rest of the world participate? How can the developing world participate in this? Well, they tell us. They ask for money to develop infrastructure. And the responses are grudging, tiny, and only obtained at the cost of an immense amount of badgering on the part of the heads of other governments. So, what we have is a situation in which the economic conditions that have prevailed have led to the creation of large new pockets of poverty in nations that used to be affluent through the reliance on that bastardized version of Smith's invisible hand passage. Namely, well, we don't need central planning. What we need is to equip the entrepreneur to do the good for society that entrepreneurs always do because of the invisible hand. And that's led to this large pool of people whose lives are already precarious. And these people realize very, very clearly that the lives that they have would be further disrupted by what the activists want. And if we are honest, what can we say to them? Not, if we go on as we are, humanity is doomed, but if we follow Greta Thunberg, all will be okay. That is completely dishonest. And it's dishonest because this is a probabilistic matter. This is decision under uncertainty, real uncertainty, radical uncertainty. What we can say to them is, if we continue on the course we've been taking, the probability of frequent severe challenges to future human populations will be greater than if we follow the activists. And the vulnerable poor, who see the consequences of these things for their already difficult lives, will say to us, well, which people are likely to be affected? What difficulties will they face? How severe will those difficulties be? How frequent are they likely to be? And none of these questions is answerable with any serious detail. And so the decision problem is different for two classes of people. If you are a young person, or if you are somebody who's relatively affluent and your place in society is relatively secure, you say, well, of course we should make the investment. We should do all the things that need to be done to decrease these probabilities. But if you are one of the large number of vulnerable people in many parts of the world, but in the affluent world where the money is likely to come from, in particular, you will say, look, these are incredibly nebulous things for which you're asking me to sacrifice my life and the lives of my children. You know, something will happen. Something good will happen. Technology will bail us out. And it seems to me that's an entirely reasonable response. And so it seems to me that the root problem here is that our obsession, the obsession of the right and neoliberal economists with particular unacknowledged goals has made an increasing number of people vulnerable. It's also intensified competition and undercut morally informed decision-making. And in doing so, it's made solving the climate crisis impossible. What happens when people go under present conditions to negotiate at climate summits? Well, each nation says, okay, so we've got to do some cooperative business for a while until we get to the sustainable solution. But once the sustainable solution comes out, the gloves come off again, and we have to be in the best possible position at that point. So everything is haunted by the shadow of an economic, global, competitive future. And that ruins the possibilities of making the kinds of sympathetic gestures that are needed right now. But actually, I want to say something that's even more, it seems to me, even more worrying about that. So on the account that I would give of morality, Morality emerged in our species probably between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago. It's got to be present by the time people are trading with one another. And there's evidence for trade 30 to 35,000 years ago, and it probably had to develop in smaller groups before that. How did it work? Well, we know something about how contemporary hunter-gatherers make their decisions. And they make their decisions in the way that the Smithian kind of approach would suggest. They get together in the long, cool hour, as David Hume called it, and they try to find a solution that all in their group can accept. Okay. I've argued that this is, in fact, the method that runs through, in a couple of places, the method that runs through the history of our successful ethical moments, and also in its failure to be there in our unsuccessful ethical moments. This is, I think, the deep method of ethical inquiry. And what it requires is exactly that Smithian impulse, the attempt to take the view from everywhere at once. Obviously, we'll always be falling far short of it, but making the attempt has enabled in the past, these limited, partial human beings to make genuine moral advances. But that is entirely undercut by the conditions of contemporary neoliberal economics. So we have actually abandoned, I think, what Smith himself would have proposed in our situation. So I'll just conclude by showing this rather well-heeled man, white man, privileged white man again, and suggesting that he, like Kant, gives us resources for doing better. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip, for that last fluttering thing in the bottom of Pandora's box, hope. The floor is open for discussion. Is it Heine?
Yes.
Please, yeah.
I would like to thank you very much about Lent. Thank you very much for mentioning the climate change problem. If I understood the news this morning when I was under the shower well, we have the last 12 months, each single month over 1.5 degree goal. I'm not really agree with your because, but I'm very grateful that you took the point, because if I, as an art historian and not a philosopher and not a historian of ideas, read books about climate justice or books like Ethics of Anthropocene, they are full of references of Kant. And what do we need more than Aufklärung about the problems which we are facing?
So my answer to that is actually very simple. What we need is a new economic order. And what we need is the reintegration of moral philosophy with economics. So the ambitious claim that I make is we need a particular kind of moral philosophy, which is actually it can be seen as a version of Kant's third version of the Kant categorical imperative. But the weaker conclusion is simply we need a good ability to make moral judgments, or a good theory of how to make those judgments, and then we need to reintegrate that with ethics, and not necessarily go the Smithian route, just restore the project of political economy again.
Let me make sure that I've gotten everybody. So I have next Leah, and the gentleman here by the window, your name?
Carol.
Carol, okay, Carol, and then Carol, and then Diana, and your name, please? Christine, okay. And then Kostek. Have I missed anybody? Yes. And your name? Oh, you're Kavi, right, okay, great, thank you. Leah.
Thank you. I'm very sympathetic to the project, and I'm going to ask a very old-fashioned question, which is, how do you think about social classes and power within this account? Because I completely take the sort of the moral argument and the moral critique. But then I think what comes after Smith in that whole development of Smith's argument, partly first in Ricardo and then in Marx, as you were starting to gesture, is actually an analysis of how from this expansion of commercial society, we also come to understand the formation of different groups of people which have different economic interests, and how these different economic interests get entrenched into different ideologies, and how those then make it very, very difficult to realize the kinds of moral goals that we might want to realize. So I just wanted to ask you to kind of speculate.
So let's turn from the Smithian ideal to the details of the nitty-gritty project. So how is this implemented? It's implemented in a form of deliberative democracy. That is, you bring together representative samples of those affected on various issues to deliberate together. It's crucial that they make the effort to do the mutual engagement with one another. And you now see, the obvious objection to this is just yours. So so all of the pathologies of society as it currently exists will be manifested in this population of representatives. There will be inequalities of power and status, and probably rhetorical ability as well. So how do you get beyond that? There's some encouraging news here, and you probably know this literature better than I do, but Fishkin's deliberative polls, and especially the ones that are reported in the second book, seem to that, in fact, if you organize this correctly, the powerful can be limited in their ability to dominate. So I think there are ways of staging this that will make it that can make it work. So Hélène Landemort has recently, I think, done a superb job of reviewing the kinds of forums that are available to us for this kind of task. Now, Hélène, like Fishkin, like so many people in this, is really, very much a it's all reason all the way kind of person, and I'm not. So I'm asking for something that is actually a little bit more demanding, which is the sort of the listening to one another, the mutual engagement with one another. This is for me terribly important. So it's not just a matter of being able to sort of get rid of those asymmetries in groups that are reasoning with one another, but to get rid of it to the extent that you can actually get people to get inside other people's bodies and feel the world through their skins. Yeah.
So the moderator's plea for egalitarianism in discussion, so that everybody will have a chance, if both questions and answers could be concise. You're all.
Yes, thank you for bringing back the eternal Adam Smith problem, or even the Adam
Smith problem. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Which is, how do we reconcile the capitalism of the wealth of nations with the morality of the theory of moral sentiments? And I obviously agree with a lot of the things that you said about the climate crisis and what we are missing and where we should be heading. But just going back to Smith's theory of sympathy and the moral sentiments in general, my question is about Smith's treatment of poverty, and specifically in the theory of moral sentiments, which seems to me crucial for this kind of conversation that we are having. So the way I read it is that he says, yes, there is an impartial spectator, which is a consensus of the well-off that can relate to each other. For example, if somebody is demoted from a general to a colonel, you can relate to them because you are somebody in their rank. And they can talk to you, and so you are one of a kind. But if you see somebody who is really suffering, and somebody who is really below you in terms of an economic inequality, what you need to do is you need to moderate your sympathy. And this is what human nature dictates. He claims his version of human nature dictates, but this is also what the ethics of his own treatise dictate. Do not have too much compassion for people who suffer too much, and specifically for people who actually talk about how they suffer. So a poor man in the theory of moral sentiments, can only ask for compassion from the general public of impartial spectators, the well-off, if they diminish their suffering. Then the difference between the well-off and the poor becomes smaller, and then the poor person can hope for at least some charity. But if they say, well, look how huge the difference is, well, look how much suffering there is there beyond your view, that will and should, according to Smith, absolutely close off the communication between different classes in society, right? So you began by saying that Smith's treatise is about expanding sympathy as a universal moral principle. It seems to me that it's about limiting sympathy. It's about not feeling too much sympathy. And then there is the model of tragedy, right? When you go into tragedy, Smith says in the theory of moral sentiments, your goal as a spectator is to moderate your compassion for the characters, right? So I'm finishing. So the question is, how do we deal with this imperative to not think too much about the people who are actually suffering out of our spaces of deliberation?
Okay, so you've read a different book than the one I've read, but I think there is some basis for what you say. I mean, there are moments in the theory of moral sentiments where there are remarks that suggest the kinds of things that you're saying. But the attitude that you are giving us of Smith's own seems to me much more like Hume's. And of course, Hume and Smith were great friends, and there are Humean bits that spill over. And of course, the theory of moral sentiments goes through several editions, and there are, and like Darwin, Smith sort of mucks around with, sometimes gets rid of universalizing insights that he had before, and sometimes adds them. So what I would say is this: I disagree with your interpretation of the impartial spectator. The impartial spectator really is the view from everywhere. And that includes the unmodified, their raw, deeply suffering experience. That gets registered too. So I think that's so. I mean, Smith's view treats all the mirrors equally. That's the theoretical view. But when he comes to talk about particular phenomenon, okay, what I think is going on is that he is bringing into account other perspectives on what's going on, the perspectives of other sufferers. And I mean, this is back to the problem that came up this morning about, what happens when I've got too many victims around. And he's using that, I think, to diminish our concern for any particular one, especially for those who may be suffering less than others. Anyway, but look, Smith interpretation is difficult, and I've given you a kind of shall we say, a bit of a cleaned up version, but it's not as anywhere near as badly cleaned up as your version suggested. I think there are traces of this sort of Humean sort of affection for the rich. But the impartial spectator is not confined to a single class by any means. This is the view from everywhere.
Diana.
I was, with regard to those people in the society who would be even worse off if some of the changes were created.
Yeah.
My question is the following. Such a new economic order, can it exist without borders? And can it exist with democracy? I hope it's compatible with both.
Look, will it happen? Will we get a return to the sort of to?
I think Diana didn't finish
Sorry.
it.
Just a second.
Yeah.
This.
Sorry, Diana.
This is a burning political question across Europe, where you have an enlightened technocratic class that thinks in terms of ecology, and then you have people who are actually being destroyed by that and who will go for populist solutions. It's in democracy, it's not outside of democracy. And the market and even the technocrats will say, and this is very interesting in terms of organic products for the elites, and the only way to keep the society together is to make sure you have cheap imported meat or whatever, coming from the fringes of something like the European Union, with which those who are not in a position to be deliberating can keep feeding themselves. And the precipitous decline of organic products, simply in a country like France, is a symbol of this particular bad sort of scissor effect that I wanted to stress about the whole issue of democracy.
So I would say that we're living in quasi-democracies, because I think with Dewey that democracy is not just a matter of people getting together and voting periodically, nor is it even a matter of people having certain constitutional protections, nor is it a matter of people having access to reliable information, which God knows quite a lot of people don't. It's a matter, I mean, there's a wonderful line in Democracy and Education by Dewey where he says, democracy isn't actually primarily even political. It's a way of associated living. So for Dewey, real democracy happens when, in Fishkin's terms, the people start talking to one another. And they start talking to one another as equals. So democracy is something that we have to achieve. And so there's both a political revolution and a change envisaged, and a change in the relationship between, between politics and ethics. Those both are involved here, and it's got to be done, as it were, one problem at a time. I'm encouraged by the fact that experiments in deliberative democracy have done much better than people would have expected. I'm encouraged by that, but having this happen on the scale which is needed to affect these kinds of changes is, I admit, something we can't expect. On the other hand, and this is really my defense of myself for saying such absurd utopian things, there are occasions on which something might happen if one diagnoses a problem. So I'm diagnosing a problem. It's a disease. It's deep, and it's been caused during the last few decades. And I'm hopeful that perhaps this diagnosis will be expressed better by other people. By creative writers, for example, and that it will actually succeed in forging what I think of as genuine democracy and a move away from these arrangements. I'm a philosopher. What else can I do but try to sort these things out and figure out what's going on?
Thank you. Your reading of Smith heavily reminded me at some aspects on Amita Etzioni's idea of a responsive community, especially when it comes to not start with any guiding moral principle or something. Just sit together, listen to each other, and then find a way to solve the problem. But isn't what we need to have to be that is a working model, the investment of the idea of the natural ability to be open to someone else's needs and something like this, which I would say definitely is natural, but something that has to be learned. Can it be learned or taught without a guiding principle? Something that comes before negotiating, deliberating, and stuff like this. Something which perhaps calls like something more absolute that Bohm would say. Can we just start without a guiding principle? Because mere sitting together can be a cacophony in the end as well.
So I think we have. Look, this is based on an understanding of something I call the ethical project, which has been in existence as I said, for a very long time. And it's been done. There's this idea that there are principles which sufficiently clever or sufficiently inspired people can find is, I think, a myth that has distorted the fact that ethics is basically social. The ethical project is basically a social project in which humans construct morality together as an amplifier of a tendency that is in all of us, that Stephen noted this morning, but it's clear. This is something that we've had in common not only with one another, but with our evolutionary relatives. this ability to respond positively to our perceptions of the interest plans, etc., of others. So that, it seems to, what we've needed is an amplifier for that. And that's what these discussions do. Now, of course, they use the precedents, the principles, the ideas that have come up in our previous discussions. We build on those. But none of those is, as it were, in principle unhedged, or to be followed come what may. They are all for working out in the context of whatever problem confronts us. So of course we build up things as we go, but these are not a priori principles. They are not principles that are fixed in stone and unrevisable. These are sort of things to which particular people can appeal in the discussion to make their perspective clearer to others. That's all. Okay, so it's a slightly more complex view than I think you were giving it credit for.
Okay, so I have on my list, just to give everybody a view about time allotment, Kostek, Kavi, Stephen, Susan, and the lady here, your name please? Sabina. And I'm closing the list. I'd ask everybody, it would be wonderful if we could get everybody in. Kostek.
Including me. People.
Yes, exactly, right, yes, exactly, a fortiori, yeah.
Thank you. So you've constructed your presentation through a confrontation of their Adam Smith and your Adam Smith, right? So let's have them talk. Their Adam Smith probably would say, this deliberative democracy you're postulating is nonsense. If the climate crisis is really serious, it will affect everybody's economic self-interest by hurting the way they function, and they'll find a way to solve it. I understand your Adam Smith would respond, this is not true, because if it were true, it would have happened. We've got the climatic crisis, and nobody's doing enough to solve it. To which their Adam Smith would respond, well, that's evidence that the crisis is not nearly as serious as they maintain it is. Is there any way the two Adam Smiths can come to an agreement?
Well, I think their Adam Smith and my Adam Smith would have to go back to basics. So they would start at the place where I started with Smith's moral theory. So how do I make assessments of my conduct? I make assessments of my conduct by being mirrored, by finding myself mirrored in society. I work from there. The next question is, should I differentiate among these various mirrors? And they might have an argument about that. But that's where they begin. It's got to be done in terms of how the moral theory is constructed. And the impartial spectator, I mean, Smith does use that word, impartial. I mean, there's a sense, look, let me digress, because I'm going to take the Kantian thing for a moment. I made these remarks about the third formulation of the categorical imperative. So Kant envisages, under my interpretation, people coming together for a discussion. So there are the leading account of proceduralism inspired by the third formulation is Rawls's. But Rawls doesn't have many people coming together. He has a single rational deliberator who is deprived of information. So I'm proposing replacing that by having everybody in the picture, having everybody in the picture as equals, and having them come with their various perspectives. But now how do they combine them? They have to combine them by building on this capacity we have to empathize with one another, as Smith saw. So that's the story. Now, I mean, at this point, there are some serious issues. There's the issue that Leo raised about whether they can genuinely come together as equals. There's the issue of whether they should be given. Some people should be given more weight than others. That's something that they have to work out. I mean, this is all, it seems to me, this is all we've got for doing this. But we can draw, as I said in response to the last question, on the precedents and principles that have been used in the past not as absolute things that have to be honored, but as things that are modifiable in the course of this discussion. Yes, I think that they can come to agreement. And I think they come out in where my Adam Smith comes out.
Kavi.
Yes, thank you. Many thanks. So I fully agree that Adam Smith is not a neoliberal avant la lettre, even though it's interesting that for both Adam Smith and neoliberals, the state plays a pretty crucial role, especially as an enabler of capital, or the state in the service of capital. But I have a different point I wanted to make. I think there is a problem with the way that you try to make use of Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments for the present. And I think there are two problems here. The first one is an historical one. So Adam Smith lived in a time where capitalism was not yet prevalent. He didn't even use the term capitalism. He used, as you know, he used the term commercial society, a term he coined himself. Yeah. And he lived in a time that was still very traditional. The moral economy still played a crucial role. So he had to come up. He is a transitional figure. He lived in a time of transition where you had to argue on moral grounds in order to be taken seriously. And this is for almost all those political economists of that time. But there's also a logical problem, I would argue. There are always problems with arguing in favor of morality. So I think the main problem, and here maybe Bertolt Brecht is quite helpful in his important book, Der gute Mensch von Sichuan, the good person of Sichuan, where he argues that, well, morality always depends on your socio-economic situation. If you're poor and you don't have enough food and cannot make ends meet, then of course you will act immorally. So morality has to be embedded, contextualized, and historicized. So I think the class perspective here would be very important to take into account. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm with Nietzsche in thinking we need a genealogy of morals, but I don't think Nietzsche supplied the right one. I think the right one is given to us now by thinking about what anthropologists have found out about previous human societies, about what we know about evolution and so forth. So here I'm going to go back and unmask myself as one of those English genealogists, as Nietzsche calls them, who are his opponents. I'm an English genealogist. I'm not a Nietzschean. But you're right that, and this is again back to Leah's question, the question of whether we can exclude class from the discussion. And I just have to say we can give it a try. And Fishkin's work and Hélène Landemore's work seem to show that we can sometimes succeed.
Steve. Yes, well, Stephen, then Susan. So,
Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So, of course, as you know, the theory of moral sentiments is organized around a rejection of dichotomy. It's not benevolence versus self-interest, but it's benevolence and sympathy, self-interest, malevolence, negative and asocial, antisocial motives. And also, Smith is very aware of unintended consequences. So you do something for an egoistical purpose, it has a socially beneficent consequence. You can do something for a social purpose and have a negative consequence. So there's no intention, doesn't match outcome at all. So I think those two things you probably could integrate into your account. But what about altruism with teeth? What about altruism with teeth? That is, wanting to help other people because you know better than they do what's good for them. So how does that fit in? Does Smith have that category, altruism with teeth? And do you?
I have that category, so I'll answer for myself. So, you know, taking another person's perspective seriously actually means listening to what that person wants, not trying to impose your view about what they ought to want on them. You can then start talking to them. You can make suggestions about what they might want, but you're not there to impose. I mean, this is all about this effective engagement that I'm talking about is about taking them seriously, and what you're opposing to that seems to me something completely different and antipathetic to it. So,
Susan.
So my question connects with some others in the room. I thought Kaveh was going in a direction that I was until he came out with his Brecht quote. And I'm really not a Brechtian. That is, I think, erst kommt das Fressen, dann kommt die Moral is a statement of chronology, but it's not a metaphysical statement, okay? And if I understand you, you're thinking that our hunter-gatherer ancestors maybe, were dividing up the food and considering the morals at the same time. But what I'm really worried about, because Scave put his finger on the fact that the theory of moral sentiments was written at a very different time. And one of the things that's fascinated me, and Mill has this, I forget where, you know much better than I do, statement, well, this is what Homo economicus means, but of course no one would be so foolish as to think this is a definition of real human beings. The problem is now they do, okay? And they're, egged on not just by stupid right-wing neoliberals, but by evolutionary psychologists who turn altruism into a problem, right? Because a Homo economicus should not behave altruistically. And I wonder if you believe, as we talked about yesterday at some point, you've got a deep resistance to the transcendental and the idea that morals develop naturally. I don't care about the question of where they came from as much as I think Leah and Omri does. I mean, maybe I read too much Wittgenstein when I was a student. I don't think the question of where they come from is so important, but particularly for someone with a historicist view, if they developed, we can also lose them. And I feel like we're in an age where the very question, why did she do that, cannot be answered by, she thought it was the right thing to do. That is, there's always this Homo economicus question of, suspicion that people are asking after that. And that was a perfectly explanatory claim in the 19th century. I mean, although you have brilliant people like George Eliot and Dostoevsky questioning whether it really was the right thing for her to do or whether there weren't other motives that she was acting on. But that counted as a proper answer. And I'm not sure that it does for many people, particularly outside this room. I think the idea that Homo economicus really is the standard norm. I mean, even, again, this is literature, you must know better than I do. I've only dipped into the behavioral economists, but the behavioral economists are all about how we fall short of the model of Homo economicus, rather than whether or not it's adequate to us. And I worry that we've changed in the last century, and I wonder, I mean, hope is, that I wonder, maybe, let's say, I don't want to ask you how we could change back, but I wonder if you have any thoughts about what went into the change where a model of the human which seemed to Mill impossible could now seem to be the absolute self-evident one.
Well, it's partly, I think, the rise of an ideology, and it's partly the obvious presence in our society of large-scale, successful people who flout morality at every turn, and that leads to the question, okay, so it was the right thing to do, but why did she behave morally? I mean, what would lead someone to do that when, and so it's the ideology comes in with the thought, well, people, the natural thing for people to do is to pursue their self-interest, right? So you get that there, and then you get these tremendous examples, and so when somebody does something, the answer, she did it because it was the right thing to do, no longer seems adequate, because now we need an explanation for her taking on that occasion, the moral to be the important thing to do. And for Mill, of course, you know, if you're a genuine moral agent, you know, that's just what you do. Okay, now, the other part of what you said, I mean, look, the historical situatedness of Smith, I think I'm just going to confess. When I do the history of philosophy, I am not a scholar. I am not somebody who talks about the person in their context. I try to find in the person's text something that is interesting for a whole bunch. So, yeah. So no. I mean, I'm just that sort of person. What I'm interested in is what can we get out of this text that lives and speaks to us today. So I am quite prepared to say to the gentleman there, you know, I'm just looking for a good guy there. I'm looking for somebody. First of all, somebody who says something interesting. And I think I can do this with Nietzsche as well. I think I can do it with lots of great dead philosophers. And it's, in a certain sense, it's a kind of desecration of the dead, to go back to Stephen's talk. And in some sense, it's a kind of celebration of the dead. We'll bring them back in new guise to advise us and to steer us in the right direction. So,
a final question from Sabina.
Thanks. My original question was in the same direction as Kave's, so thank you. But I allow me a small remark, because I'm not only philosopher, but worked the last decade in a solidary cooperative. And I just want to bring this universe into this room, because that's not the change of the economic model. But it's a kind of tool I see where really huge movements, for example, the rural workers in Nigeria, together with the unions, 1 million of beauty workers in India are coming together in a kind of cooperative, but also central parts of the economy, like the South African logistic and van drivers. They are more than 5,000 now and get together. And for me, that is pretty interesting. It's not only informal economy, but there I see a tool where democratic principles, participation, also ownership and employment can get together in a new form of work in a way. And where your question, yes, that can be across borders, and it can hold democracy, and it can also include new digital tools, even AI models, but trying to become solidary. And for me, that is a small hope. It's not a general change, but it allows something, and also in different political surroundings, because in a totalitarian or communist one, it's more a kind of privatization, and in a liberal one, it's more a getting together and a new form of solidarity again. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for that. I mean, I certainly like the idea of there being movements that do the kind of thing that you describe. I mean, in a certain sense, what I'm after is democracy as a form of solidarity. I mean, it is in a sense emphasizing the ways in which people can feel that they are part of the same movement and part of the same group with one another. So that's already there. Yes, it must take place across borders, because some problems involve stakeholders scattered across the world. I mean, so democracy this kind of democratic thinking has to be expanded if we are to address certain kinds of global problems. So for me, the deliberation comes at various scales. There are some issues that are, as it were, settled within the family. There are some issues that are settled within the local community. There are some issues that are settled within the nation, or some large subset of the nation. And that there are some issues that are really transnational. And you cannot, as it were, exclude people. These discussions must be inclusive in the sense of bringing in representatives of all of the stakeholders. So I would just say that, and I would say that with respect to the climate problem, it is inconceivable to me that we will solve the climate problem unless the affluent nations of the world who might supply the infrastructure that the developing world so sorely needs, if it's to develop on the basis of renewable resources, those are going to have to be brought on board. So there has to be a change in socio-economic perspective there, I think. Now, perhaps it could come from mimicking the kinds of movements that you're describing elsewhere in the world. But I mean, it seems to me more likely to come from the recognition of what has been lost in the turn away from Keynesian economic thinking to the kind of economic thinking that is a distortion, in my view, of Smith's attitudes.
Thank you so much, Philip. So